Well, good people, I think I found the most perfect case that's been flying under the radar. Wait a second. This isn't it. Nope. Nope. Ah, there it is. The new Prime in all its glory. This thing, concept-wise, is basically just a larger NR200P enclosure from Cooler Master, but now this thing supports a micro ATX motherboard, so that's a big win. You may be wondering, what's this whole obsession with micro ATX, both in hardware and enclosures? You know, it's not as feature-rich as ATX motherboards, it's not as compact as ITX, but it's got a few things going for it. So first of all, micro ATX on the motherboard side is definitely cheaper than the same line ATX version, and sure, you do lose some functionality. For example, this micro ATX board from Prime doesn't even have Wi-Fi. How is it possible? It's a Z790 motherboard. I didn't even know that was possible. And also, this micro ATX enclosure can do everything your standard mid-tower can do, but in a much smaller footprint, except storage. This thing doesn't have much storage, okay? So this is the new Prime AP201. A weird name enclosure, but it's getting a lot of traction in the modding community. People love to water cooling this thing, and I can see why. And this case is also really affordable, around $80 for both black or the white models. There is no TG, it is all mesh to satisfy that airflow enthusiast inside of you and inside there too. Exterior is full ventilated mesh that is both good for airflow and for some dust ventilation, but the entire experience of like removing all these side panels is absolutely seamless. For example, you can see this tab at the top that helps you remove it, but the side panels have little indentations inside the frame itself, so it helps to keep the side panels clean and still give you nice little area to grab onto. Nice. Now, even though this is probably not the most porous ventilation mesh that you can find on an enclosure right now, I do appreciate that it is consistent. So this is square, and so is every other ventilation pattern on this case, including the PCI slots, nice attention to detail, and also we have a large dust filter at the bottom. The I/O is also nicely and easily accessible right at the front with dual USB A's and a full 10 gigabit per second USB-C. As for the interior, I feel like ASUS has done a good job to try and optimize its space for the 33-liter volume. You know, it's not as compact as ITX, but the main thing is not as tall as your standard mid-tower, but it has enough length to support all your needed components. So cooling-wise, you can do a 360 at the top or a 280 mil radiator at the top as well. So having support for 140s at the top is very welcoming. We can do dual 120s at the bottom for additional support for GPU cooling. A rear exhaust fan is included, which is 120 mil fan, and CPU tower heat sinks are 170 millimeters, which is plenty wide, I would say, for this level of enclosure. And this rear fan has a little bit of that vertical mobility because of these strips, just in case you need additional clearance at the top or the bottom. So a total of 6 fans can fit inside this micro ATX enclosure. The power supply goes at the front below this cover that is fully compatible with ATX units up to 180 millimeters, which is plenty. But, so here behind the front panel, you can see we have 3 locations for our power supply. The power supply bracket is nice and sturdy. It's supported with 2 screws at the bottom and this like a little hinge system at the top, so it's very easy to work with. And that means that you can move it slightly down if you need additional height clearance for your fans or radiators or whatever. And for example, if you don't necessarily require all this space at the bottom for cables. But the more you go down with this bracket, the less area you create for those really long graphics cards. And so you have 328 millimeters until this bracket. If you could move this all the way up to clear out some of that space for a really long GPU, then you can fit it no problem. And especially if you're going for something really short, like 140 millimeter power supply that will just like stop right here, then this is great. But otherwise, it's a little bit limiting for those really, you know, massive 4080s. The single most annoying thing on this entire case is this power supply cover. So the good thing is it hides the cables, it has some branding. And 4 screws later, you would just think you'd be able to just simply pull this out, right? But because it has the tabs here in the bottom, it's actually very difficult to take this out when you have stuff installed, when the power supply is installed here too. So it's a little bit annoying, especially in trying to put this back. And you have to do it at exactly the right angle because otherwise it's just gonna catch a lot of the panels inside. And yeah, this whole thing of like reinstalling this panel back in place is just a nightmare. Woohoo! I would say this case is still quite friendly for ITX users, you know, given all the cooling compatibility, massive GPUs, still an ATX power supply up there. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that the ITX motherboard is still fairly small, so we do have that exposed CPU cutout at the back, but it's still good for cable management. And otherwise, this was a really simple and easy system to assemble. My only hesitation of like keeping an ITX motherboard in here is that most small motherboards don't have that many fan headers, and even though you can install a hub, I'd like to avoid that. So a micro ATX motherboard in here would definitely be a little bit more compatible with all the cooling that you can fit in here. And now looking at the micro ATX system, so definitely it fills the space a little bit more. The 24-pin cable exits in the right place, for example. This is the power supply bracket that's in the lowest position, and with my 360 AIO with cables on the front, I'm still bumping in those cables. So it's not ideal, but it's not an issue. It's not like blocking or kinking. Here's what the above PSU area looks like. So easy access for our on-off switch. We do have an extension cord over here that I had no issues routing either this way or facing the front, so that's not a problem. The only thing is that, of course, all this area is kind of tight with the tubes from the AIO, but nothing is poking each other to prevent functionality. Everything is working as is. I replaced the fan in the back for that black and white aesthetic, plus the yellow. I really like how everything looks, and basically everything was flawless. There's still plenty of room underneath the GPU if I wanted to mount two 120mm fans at the bottom for additional GPU cooling. I'm not doing that because I find them too loud, but there's clearly space for it. I do find this whole front area to be slightly less optimized. For example, I don't understand why this ventilation pattern is here. This would be great if it was open so you can have access for your power supply on-off switch, maybe additional cabling over here or whatever. And also with the power supply in its lowest position, the SSD and the hard drive area over here is completely blocked, so not fully optimized properly. Cable management is totally fine. I had to bunch up my fan cables because they do not daisy chain. That's unfortunate, but everything is running in their own channels. There's plenty of room, at least for my 150mm unit, for the power supply underneath to bunch up your cables. There's this main channel over here that has plenty of space from the side panel. There's a Velcro strap at the very top here that is useless. It's way too high. And the other Velcro straps, they are not the good kind that do not allow you to give you that good tension. But otherwise, it's perfectly fine for the system, and everything closes without any issues. Noise. I will say I do not like the location of the power plug at the top. It doesn't follow the rest of the cables. It's way too bulky coming from there. And there's actually room at the bottom if you want to experiment with some modding for you to reroute this thing. So yeah. As for temperatures, do not even worry about the CPU side because we have all that space for a CPU tower heatsink and all that room above for an AIO. Not a problem there. As you can see, the temperatures with my 240mm AIO are perfectly fine. And even removing the side panels do not contribute that much additional cooling, so that's a good thing. That means the perforations here are doing a good job. And also adding in the additional fan at the bottom does give me slightly cooler CPU temps. But what impressed me the most is actually GPU side of things, because normally when you don't have a lot of exhaust or intake for the GPU, that makes things a bit hotter in that bottom chamber. But clearly all the mesh on the exterior actually helps to deliver enough airflow in there that's more passive airflow that's being intaked by all the exhaust fans. And as you can see, the GPU is perfectly fine. Removing the side panels does help a little bit, but also adding an additional fan at the bottom. Only a single fan here gives me a 4-degree drop on the GPU side at load, and I would say that's a win. Although it is very loud because it's right against the mesh, plus we have a dust filter there, so I would definitely recommend keeping that bottom fan at low RPM. But seriously, really impressed with the performance on here with a single stock rear exhaust fan. That's unheard of. Now, I do have a few reservations with the AP201. Number one is that we don't have a TG version. I feel like this case lends itself beautifully to be showcased on your desk because it is fairly compact, and having no TG is kind of weird, but I understand why. And also having that side mesh and not being able to mount any fans on it, it's also perhaps a missed opportunity there. But again, because the mesh is fairly confined, if you put any fan in there, it's going to introduce a lot of that turbulent noise like we heard with the bottom intake fan. Secondly, I would love to have more mounting options for the power supply bracket, just because in the lowest position, it's still a little bit too close to my AIO and all the tubes that's coming out, and plus the IO cables there too. And if I'm not using that bottom area for cables, I might as well lower it. And of course, storage is absolutely limited in here. Definitely stick to M.2 drives on your motherboard directly, or that single SSD, or you can move SSDs on the bottom floor. But man, those things are just so inaccessible to access and are a little bit difficult to route. And you already know my complaint about that side PSU cover. Way too difficult to install and remove, should be simplified. But overall, I feel like the AP201 lends itself a really affordable, compact, feature-rich, good compatibility hardware enclosure that should definitely be on your radar if you're looking for something a bit more sleek, you know, not too flashy. And even though with RGB components installed inside, they do peek through the ventilation patterns, makes itself for a pretty enclosure on any surface. I'm Dimitri, thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you in the next video.